So today I'm excited we get to start talking about Plato. And Plato loved to use allegorical images to help give like pictures of the deep abstract concepts he was trying to relate to his audience. And the one I wanted to start off was his allegory of the chariot. And in this allegory of the chariot, and I've heard different versions of this, but from the Phaedrus or Phaedrus and other writings, we have this idea where the human soul is likened to a chariot driver. And I'm going to give my own personal opinion about using a chariot allegory later from more of like, I would say, a Christian perspective. But the way I understand Plato's understanding is the soul pre-exists before its mortal or earthly form. And this symbol of the soul, you have the charioteer who represents reason or like the logos, but then you have two horses. One is a white horse, which is a spirited animal, but it's full of those important passions that can lift us to greatness. And so things like courage, honor, value, or valor, fortitude, these are passionate responses, but they're also noble. But there's also a dark horse, and this dark horse is also passionate, but its passions are for the base desires of life. Things like wine, women, and song, things that would have to do with the flesh or physical gratification. And so here you have this crazed, lustful horse that's trying to drag the chariot and its rider in the direction it wants to go. And it's just frothing at the mouth. It just wants that pleasure. And you have your noble steed that's striving for all these high-end ideals with equal passion and vigor. So you have these two horses trying to go in opposite directions. And the chariot driver of reason, of the logos, of the analytical, logical mind, is trying to guide the spirited good horse, but also to check the spirited carnal horse so that all three of them can go in a healthy, prosperous direction. But what happens is the more base the appetites become and the desires, these winged horses actually lose their wings, and the human soul finds itself here on earth in a physical mortal form, like in this frame of a human body. But that chariot motif is still going on inside of my soul, where I have my reason trying to keep hold of and direct these two horses. And if perchance I can give enough lead to that noble horse, my soul itself can take wing and flight again and return me to the heavenly realms from which I came. And so there's Blackburn's interpretation of Plato's allegory of the chariot. Now, I love a lot about this allegory, but the more I've been studying the Greek concepts of the soul, I think he has the wrong person in the driver's seat. And you might say, no, Plato did it exactly how he wanted. And he's like one of the most brilliant people in history, so leave his allegory alone. But if I was personally going to have to make a similar allegory, I would put the nous or the mind in the chariot seat. One horse would be the logos, reason, and the other horse would be cardia, passion. That's how I see the soul. But our nous is that highest functioning piece. And what I believe happened in the Garden of Eden was that's where spiritual death occurred. We were cut off from the Spirit of God, even though our physical bodies continued to live, and our understanding or our mind, our nous, N-O-U-S, was darkened. Before our nous fell, I think it was able to control the chariot of our souls. It could reason correctly, like logically, through the logos, but it could also enjoy the noble passions that came from the heart. It was able to keep the more base passions in check. but collectively, the nous as the driver, and then the logos as the white horse, and the cardia as the dark horse made up that inner workings of the mind. And then to further this in a Christian hijacking of Plato's allegory, the next question I would ask you, who has a hold of the reins? Is it you or is it Jesus? Who is driving the chariot? Who has control? Yes, you are still there in the chariot, but if it so be that the Spirit of God is in you, you actually have the choice to hand the reins to the Spirit. So it's not even your own nous who is the chariot driver or is in control anymore. He has given up his ability to steer the chariot to the very Spirit of God. At least that's where I'm going with my ethics book. So any thoughts on Plato's allegory of the chariot? All right. Well, it's Allegory Day. I love allegories. And so I'm going to show you another one. And this one's called the Allegory of the Cave. And you guys have probably heard this one before. There it is. You see that? Yep.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day, a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that a prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the free prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
Nice claymation. I enjoyed that. So in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, I'll just recap quickly. You have these prisoners and they're chained in such a way that they can't really look to their left or right, let alone behind them. And so their whole life, they assume that these shadows cast on the wall is reality. Well, one prisoner, and there's always one, right? He fidgets and he squirms until he's able to kind of get a peek over his shoulder. And he's like, what the heck's going on back there? And he's given a choice. Once he realizes that these shadow casters, and the shadow casters represent politicians, teachers, religion, media, all these groups that are trying to get us to buy into what they're selling as being reality. And that's what we're seeing cast upon the wall. But once you see the game and that they're just manipulating and trying to get you to see the world or reality as they're casting it to you, you often get a choice. They'll say, join us, and you too can be a shadow caster, or you got to leave because we don't want you messing with this setup we have here. We don't want you going down causing discontent among the other prisoners, saying you're living a lie. There's a greater reality. And so eventually this former prisoner makes his way outside of the cave, and now he actually sees the real light of day. He sees the sun in all its glory and illumination. And this represents for Plato the realm of ideal forms. This is true reality, the real light, the pure light, not a concept of the light and not an imitation or a symbol or a shadow of the light. This is the light in all its glory in this place of illumination.
Is that
But
like
now, go ahead, Carlos.
I was just going to say, is that like when you become enlightened?
Yes.
Yeah.
You begin to see things as they actually are, not as people are telling you they are, or as you've been deceived by your senses, thinking that the sense perception is actual reality, when reality is much farther beyond that. But if you become enlightened, well, if you have any kind of conscience or character, you're going to want to go back into the cave to rescue your fellow companions that are still chained in the darkness. And this is really kind of like a memorial to Socrates, because Plato saw Socrates as someone who saw the light, someone who was wise and illumined, and he was trying to pull the chains off his fellow Athenians' ankles and wrists and pull the blinders off their faces. But they just thought he was a crazy man because they couldn't comprehend what he was saying. It was too fantastic. And the shadow casters of Athenian society saw him as a threat, and so they had him executed. You could also use this as a metaphor for the life of Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, anyone who was thinking beyond their people or their time and tries to bring a message that is so revolutionary and flips reality on its head. Often those people end up suffering martyrs' deaths. And so it's a really neat illustration to talk about when we were talking about Socrates, and I wanted you to understand the Platonic forms. So the cave itself would be like this physical world of appearances, our flesh and blood bodies, the tables and chairs and rooms we're sitting in, physical trees, physical sunshine, all that. These are the shadows. This is the shadowland that we're living in. We are in the cave. But if you study philosophy, if you start to conceptualize and think about the true nature of the physical things you're seeing, and you think about their perfect form, that is like someone who's become unshackled and is now kind of in that intermediary place. But to be fully enlightened, to truly understand the eternal and perfect forms, you have to go out of the cave into this realm of eternality, these eternal ideas. And I don't know, I love the symbolism and metaphor here, and it very much resonates with me.
Absolutely. Have you ever, I mean, I don't know, from your experience, have you had any like trouble going through that? Like, what was your biggest, because it's so hard, you know what I mean? You go through your life experience and like you want to tell like your parents or your friend or a loved one, you know what I mean, what you're going through, and they just look at you like you're just an alien.
At some point with certain people, you just have to let them be and enjoy their shadows are watching on the wall, because you can't convince them. I personally, from a Christian perspective, think it has to be an inner illumination given from God to let you know you're even in the darkness. Otherwise, how would you even know you were in the darkness if you didn't have anything to compare it to? Most of my issues is not with people that are chained, it's with the shadow casters, because they don't like me messing with the chained up people, because they're afraid something will click and they're going to lose another prisoner, basically. So my conflict is more trying not to get martyred or executed by other shadow casters who don't want me messing with their vision of reality, because I'm trying to point towards what I believe is a greater reality beyond the shadows, the casters, and to get people out into the full light of day, which from my perspective is Jesus. Jesus is that light that illumines everyone that comes into the world. But Jesus would be another great example. Think about John 1. He was the light of the world, right? And the world was made by him, but the world comprehended him not. He came unto his own, but his own received him not. And in a smaller scale, I would say Socrates was a very much this type of character. Now, Socrates didn't come to reconcile God to man and to die for the sins of the world, but he definitely was a visionary, and he was coming from such a radically different place than his contemporaries that it was truly shocking. And many thought he was a madman, or at least a troublemaker, and needed to be dealt with. Now, that allegory of the cave, I believe, comes from Plato's Republic. And I want to pull up an image while I'm talking about this. I thought I'd have a nice little neat one waiting for me. All right, well, we'll see if this one works. No, I lost my image. Sorry, I should have prepped this up ahead of time. There we go. All right, can you see that okay, that image? Okay, so in Plato's Republic, he has a very hierarchical sense of how society should be governed. The vast majority of people are going to be quite simple, and they're called the hoi polloi. It's like the common people, the riffraff, your everyday man. And in our society or culture, this would be like your blue-collar workers, your tradesmen, your house cleaners, your gardeners, but it would even include people like craftsmen and artisans and those sorts of people. The people that are working in the fields, they're making the products we enjoy, but they're really focused with the physical materiality of life. of the care and nurture of the physical body. These are like the people of the earth, and they make up the vast majority. But then we have the next rung, and this is a less percentage of the population, but these are our military to defend our city or our state. These are the police to make sure there's civil authority going on and there aren't riots and lootings and murders. And it could also be like security or social enforcement. And this would make up a much smaller percentage, but then by far the rarefied air at the top, these should be philosophers, people who are dealing with outside of the cave thinking, looking at the ideal forms and then trying to apply them to society and culture at large. And it doesn't just have to be one person. You could have a group, a collective of philosophers ruling the country, but it needs to be people of the mind of this higher perspective, not people caught down in the base physical material world and appetites. And I think it's really interesting because part of the protections and privileges, each group of society has different rights, privileges, and expectations. So for the people living there at the base and the bottom, sure, they may not have the noble ideas and thoughts of the philosopher kings and be able to peek into what is the good, the true, and the beautiful, but they're really good about baking bread and making sure the fruit gets to market and to building your house and to making the parchment and providing the ink that you're writing all your great ideas down with. So they're an important part of society. But because they have a simple life, because they're just dealing with the physical material needs of the body, they're allowed to have those pleasures. They're allowed to marry. They're allowed to have children. They're allowed to acquire wealth and to trade and barter and build palaces and all this stuff they are allowed to do. Now, the next rung, these are servants of the state. So they're not just private citizens anymore. They're not just looking out for their own interest or their own benefit or their own profit, because they are the guardians of the city. And it might require them at some point to lay down their own lives for the good and protection of all. But because of that willingness to lay down their lives, they are given authority over others. But then the highest and most rarefied rung, in order to keep from corruption, they are not allowed to marry. They are not allowed to own property. They are not allowed to hoard wealth, but they are the complete servants of the state. They belong to the state, almost like a queen in a hive of termites or bees, where they are responsible for not populating the state like a queen bee or termite does, but they have the authority and rule over all the different rungs. And it is their wisdom, their vision, and their will that is to guide the state. Now, they can eat, they're on like a pension, their needs are provided, their housing, their food, their sexual needs are taken care of, but they do not own anything. They don't have their own spouse. They're simply provided people that will take care of their sexual needs or interests. They don't own vineyards or orchards, but they're provided fruit and wine. They don't own fields and crops, but they're provided bread and meat. They don't own their own home, but they do have like government housing to sustain them while they're taking care of the needs of the people. And so this is Plato's vision of how a republic should work. He, like Socrates, do not believe in democracy because they believe democracy will devolve into mob rule. And the majority, the people living down below, don't have sense. They don't know any better. And they're going to let some tyrant or other person end up ruling them, swaying them with enticing words and promises. And that's why you need a philosopher king in charge of the whole system. Any questions, comments so far?
A lot of that, I mean, I don't know. I feel like, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I can see, I feel like I can still see a lot of that and today. Is this where the chain of command, did that kind of adopt the same process, or like, the chain of command?
I don't know about that. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there's some sort of, because Plato is really into these hierarchies. And see, in a sense, this is the cave, just we've turned it on its side. The people in the green, those are the people chained looking at the shadows on the wall. The red would be like the shadow casters, controllers. But the real truth, the real enlightenment would be that top rung, those who have peered outside the cave into the full light of day. And they're the ones who should be in charge, not the shadow casters, and certainly not the hoi polloi who are completely lost in ignorance and confused that the sense world is the real world. Now, this much on paper doesn't look scary or disturbing, at least not to me as a philosopher. Obviously, I would get to be in the top if this is how society worked, which I would be more than happy to tell other people how they should live, especially if I had a whole cast of people there to enforce my will upon the majority. I mean, how fun would that be? And especially if you're doing it from altruistic motives, because you're really trying to bring these principles of the good, the true, and the beautiful down to people that don't really understand it or know what it means. But you can see the authoritarianism just lurking behind the door, right? And these people on top literally get to say what is the good, the true, and the beautiful, and how things should be run. And that's a lot of authority to give a human being. Now, in a democracy, we divide what is the good, the true, and beautiful among the population, and they vote, and the majority gets their taste or their preference or their point of view, like whichever is their favorite shadow that they're voting for. But Plato's like, what nonsense? Why should we give the common people the right to vote for which illusion is the best illusion when we could offer them reality? It doesn't make any sense. The lower rungs of society need to be ruled and governed by those who know, not by those who don't know. So they are not thinking of this democratic egalitarian society. They're thinking some people were born or trained to rule, some to enforce, and others to produce. And so it's very much like a hive mentality applied to human society. The bottom would be like the worker bees, the middle would be like the warrior or protector bees, and then the top would be like the queen bee. Any other questions, comments? I mean, if you try to talk anti-democratic in America, people are gonna have big problems with you, right? It's become so sacrosanct with being an American. Like, we believe in a democracy, but don't be confused either philosophically or religiously that that's like some design that came from God, right? If you look through at least the biblical period, for most of the part, it was monarchies. And before that, we had judges or stewards or shepherds who were in the place of God. They were like human representatives of a theocracy, and a theocracy is where God rules. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, God was the Lord and King and Shepherd of Israel. And so remember when the Israelites wanted their own king like the other nations, how put off Samuel was? He's like, gee whiz, God, or gee whiz, Jehovah, I'm here trying to represent you to the people in your name, and now they've completely rejected me. They want a king instead. And God's like, you're put out? They want to replace me, their king, with a human. I'm the one who's put out. But he let them have a king anyways, and that king was Saul, if you remember. And so a theocracy is very different from this model, and that's what we saw in the Bible, then followed by monarchy. You don't find any democracy in the Bible unless you want to talk about, in the New Testament, there's some examples where they cast lots or chose who. That's another thing. instead of voting, they would cast lots, which is more like luck or chance. But they were expecting like divine intervention where God would show who he wanted to be ruler or who was the guilty one or whatever. But that's incorporating like the supernatural or mystical techniques into political or social decision-making process. And so that's a very different system than American democratic republic. Now, a republic might be a little bit better than a democracy, which a pure democracy would be one person, one vote. Everyone has an equal say. And a democratic republic, which is what the United States of America actually is the people choose among themselves representatives, and then the representatives get to vote and make the laws to govern the people. So it's kind of like an in-between version of this pyramid, but we don't have that top philosopher king rung. What we have is representatives ruling over the people, but the people get to choose the people to represent them. That's a democratic republic. Any other questions or comments on this? Okay. Now you might say, well, but Blackburn, last class you said this was really horrifying because it reminded you of the Third Reich or Nazi Germany. This doesn't sound anything like the Third Reich or Nazi Germany. Well, what happened with the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, they took Plato's, this is like the grand big picture, but then he systematically went through in every aspect of society how to bring about this sort of thing. And that's where it gets really disturbing to me. So for example, if you're familiar with ancient Greek writings, like let's take the Homeric poems, like the Battle of Troy and Ulysses sailing home, right? We have these ancient epic poems. But do you guys remember how the gods and goddesses are portrayed? Like, let's take example, the Battle of Troy. What were the gods and goddesses doing at the Battle of Troy? In fact, why did that whole issue start in the first place with Helen? Do you remember why? Was it Aphrodite that got offended by Helen? Was that the goddess? Anyone remember your Greek mythology? It was one of the goddesses of beauty, and people were praising Helen as being even more beautiful than the goddess of beauty, and she was offended by it. And so she was just like, I'm on team Greece versus team Troy. And you had the gods split right down the middle, half the gods supporting the Trojans and the other half supporting the Greeks. And so it wasn't just a battle between the Greek city-states and the city of Troy, but it was also the different gods and goddesses were also involved in the melee. And that's something I wish someone would make a version of Troy including the gods, because whenever they do remakes of that movie, like that famous one they did with Brad Pitt playing Achilles, it's all physical material. There's no divine intervention, but the gods were fighting amongst themselves as much as the mortal men and women. Anyways, when you look at the character of these gods and goddesses portrayed by Homer, they're quite horrifying. These gods are adulterers, murderers, drunkards, violent, thieves, tricksters, and Plato is like, if we're teaching our young people that this is what the gods are like, well, it's just going to justify them acting out in the same way. So we need to censor and ban any book or literature that degrades the gods down to the realm of like anthropomorphic gods. We shouldn't be teaching those kind of deities to our children. We need to be teaching them about this high, noble, pure, good, true, and beautiful God or gods. Okay, so that's his view on literature. He only wants noble, inspiring, so no true crime dramas, no murder mystery, books, no books talking about sexual dalliance or perversion, but we want hey cat, we want we we want books that are going to bring nobility and soul and character, that are pointing to the light outside the cave, not in the puke in the gutter at our feet. Music needs to be noble, and it needs to lift the soul and the spirit. So Plato wanted things like military marches and bands and things that, like, the raw music to get people up and motivated all on the same team or the same cause or the same venue. There's no blues for Plato. There's no country and western or folk music. There's no dirges, because those are base, demoralizing things that stir up these, like, the dark horse passions within us, right? The wine, women, and song feelings. I mean, don't listen to that kind of moody, downer music, because that kind of clips your chariot's winged horses of their wings and brings you crashing back down to the ground. So we want music that is noble, pure, transcendent, pointing towards these ideal forms in the heavens. And maybe it's because I was raised American and the First Amendment and all that stuff, but it's so horrifying to me as a modern when I start hearing what the steps to getting this sort of philosopher king society looks like to Plato has to do with control of education, of the media, of literature, of music, of dress, of morals, of architecture, of speech. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, yeah, I've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. And now maybe if the people on top of the Third Reich would have been true, enlightened philosophers instead of Nazis, maybe it would have turned out differently, but I don't know, because there still would have been the censorship, the control, and in a way, and I hope this isn't too edgy, but I have really similar thoughts. Well, this could get me in trouble, but we got to say it. Groups like the moral majority in our own country, even though I align with a lot of their worldview and their belief in God and what is the good, the true, and the beautiful, I really don't like the idea of imposing my standards on the rest of society that does not share my worldview, let alone have the Holy Spirit within them. So for me to tell a secular humanist, you can't write that kind of textbook, or you can't read that sort of novel, or to tell bands you can't produce that type of music, yeah, you could make a lot of conformity, but I think it's just going to be external conformity where people are going to be gnashing at the bit on the inside because it's going so contrary to their desires and their nature. And I would much rather see like a conversion of heart where they change their appetites than to try to impose a structure on people from the outside and they have to conform within that, otherwise they're punished or booted out of society or executed. And unless God's in control, I don't want any human viceroy or representative telling me, sorry, Brother Blackburn, but it's off to the stake with you today because you think funny, or we didn't like the Bob Dylan tunes you were humming, or we don't like the way you dress or the way you wear your beard, or 1,000 other things that they may not approve of. Or maybe they didn't like the book I wrote or the way I'm teaching my class, or because I'm calling out someone in society. And love it on paper, not real happy with people who've tried to apply this in the world in a historical sense or context.
Have you seen the show Survivor with all those people that are on the island?
I have not.
I don't know. I saw that pyramid and I was like, dude, that reminds me of that show a lot.
Oh, really? How so?
Because there's like a bunch of people put onto this island, and they have to do, and there are people from like all different backgrounds, and then they kind of have to like work with each other. But then you have the people that are like the puppeteers, you know what I mean? Then you have like it's just like that, like that same pyramid foundation. It's just like that. They all say that they're friends, and you always have the leaders, but kind of like hidden. They're like hidden in plain sight. They kind of like control the game, um, in the village and then off the village because they have to go out and compete and stuff like that. It's pretty
I guess what I kind of want to leave you with on this is big pictures with Plato is he's the father of idealism because he believes, stop picking at my couch, because he's believes ideas or these eternal forms are more real than the physical material world in which we live. And then this realm of concepts, thinking about the ideal forms, is this realm in between. So we've got this physical material kitty sitting on my shoulder, but he is only a pale representation, like a shadow, compared to my concept of cat or feline, because my conception of feline is so much greater than this individual manifestation of a physical cat, because the concept of feline is rich, right? All the way from lions and tigers, all the way down to lynxes and bobcats, to our common or not so common, our precious little house kitties. But even if every cat in the world went extinct or was destroyed, we would still have the conception of the feline because it's eternal. It can't be created or destroyed. It has always been there. And that's the realm where Plato is living. And so he gets the grand title of the father of idealism. And then next week, we'll talk about his great disciple, Plato, who becomes the father of materialism or realism. This idea of the sense perception world, that's what's more real. This Aristotle would say this this physical kitty, this is the real kitty. And then if I collect a bunch of different cats and look at them, or different species of feline, like lion, tigers, lynx, bobcats, ocelots, house cats, I can look at them, and then using my reason, I can say, oh, these are similar traits that all these different individual characters share in this category of feline. But Aristotle says we start with the physical material, then we think about it, and then we develop eternal concepts or abstract ideas. Plato is like, no, no, foolish disciple. We start with the ideal forms, then we think about it, and then we identify it in the physical material world. Let me give you one more example to make sure you got it. I'll use number one. I brought him home from my office because I was missing him. Okay, so in Plato world, he would observe this mug, but he knows it's a mug because he has an eternal conception in his mind of what a mug is. And because this conforms to the ideal form of coffee mug, he would proclaim this a good mug. Now, on the flip side, I have this coffee mug. We have lots of different coffee mugs, and Aristotle is saying what you have to do is you have to get a collection of all these coffee mug type things, and then we look at what are things that are common to all of them. And all of these hold liquid, they have handles, they're made out of different materials, etc. But Aristotle is looking at the physical material aspect of them, where Plato is seeing how well does this conform to my ideal of coffee mugness. When I bought this mug, I bought it as a Platonist because it leapt off of the shelf at me screaming, I am the closest approximation to the ideal form as you're going to see on this physical material earth. Yes, I am flawed. Yes, I am not perfect. Yes, someday I will return to the elements from which I came, but I am a physical manifestation that most closely resembles the eternal form. Unlike this mass-produced, soulless souvenir mug. Okay? It's still a mug, but it's much less close to the ideal form than this mug. And you might say, well, how do you know that, Blackburn? Because I have a template in my mind, like a holograph of that realm of ideal forms. And as a philosopher, when I remove myself every day more and more from the shadows on the cave or the world of appearances, and I begin to work my way towards this realm of ideal forms, then I can bring that knowledge back into the world of appearances and be like, ah, this one. But I can do that with horses, with flowers, with people, with concepts. I can determine, because of the template within me, what aligns closer to the ideal and what is further away. And that's how I would make value judgments. That which is closer, I would say is good. That which is further away, I would say is broken or evil. Aristotle, on the other hand, being a materialist, he's going to start with the physicality of the mug. So he's going to say, well, it looks like a mug, it feels like a mug, it tastes like a mug, it smells like a mug, and it's functioning as a mug. So Aristotle is going to look at form and function and then think about what that is and what that means. And then he can make universal applications. But he starts with the concrete, physical, goes to ideas, reason, and then up to the ideal form. Plato is starting from on high, thinking about it, and then applying that to the physical material world. And even though on the surface, it looks like Plato and Aristotle are opposites, I really think they're more like two sides to the same coin. They really both have very similar worldviews. They both agree there's a real, physical, material world. They believe there's this realm of thoughts and conceptions, but they also believe in the eternal, immortal world and a soul or life that lives past this physical frame. It's simply Aristotle is starting from the ground, working his way up, and Plato is starting with the forms and working his way down. And in Raphael's famous Renaissance painting, The School of Athens, and maybe I'll pull that up for you real quick and I'll leave you with this one. In his famous picture, The School of Athens, we get, open one more tab. There it is. Oh, come on, give me where's a big one? Oh, there we go. Ooh, it's a lot of tabs. So I love this picture because you got a lot of these old philosophers from Pythagoras, and a lot of the pre-Socratics we've been talking about are in this painting. Even Raphael painted himself into this picture, like a little cameo shot. He's cut out of this picture. But the two center figures, we have Plato on the left with that glorious beard. He looks kind of familiar, doesn't he? And then on the right, we have Aristotle. And you see Plato is pointing up to emphasize the ideal, and Aristotle's pointing down towards the earth, towards the physical material. And so that painting's called The School of Athens. It's an allegorical painting. And I mean, Plato is massive and his impact on the West is profound. But I think that's enough to give you a good feel for him and his importance. And so next week on Tuesday, we will pick up with his great disciple, Aristotle. Any questions, comments? Nope. All right. Well, have a great weekend, you guys. I think I put up, I did. I put up another quiz for you. So make sure you take that by Sunday midnight, Sunday 11:59. It's just 10 questions on the pre-Socratics. I tried to pick up where I left off from the last quiz, the first quiz. Rhea, are you still here? Okay. I'll leave a note for them in the dashboard that they need to do that. But thank you, guys.
See you later. Have a good weekend.
You too.